Good afternoon. On behalf of Historic Northampton and in partnership with the Smith College History Department, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the second lecture in the 350th Anniversary Lecture Series. I want to call your attention, before we move on to our program, to the fact that these lectures are funded by the Massachusetts Foundation for the Humanities with promotional underwriting from WFCR Public Radio. And we in Northampton are very fortunate to have the Massachusetts Foundation for the Humanities as part of the cultural infrastructure of our community. And we're grateful for their support of quality programs like this one, not only in Northampton, but all across the state. A half-century ago, when Northampton celebrated its 300th anniversary, 300th birthday, no other than Harry Miller himself presented the Jonathan Edwards lecture at the First Church on the site of the original Edwards Meeting House. Now, those attending the lecture wore period costumes to evoke the spirit of the Edwards era. And it's not recorded what Professor Miller wore. But though we're not in costume today, I want to set the scene for today's lecture with a little evangelical exhortation. Some of you may have read the announcement that Historic Northampton has been selected as the only museum in New England and one of 10 nationwide to receive a National Endowment for the Humanities Challenge Grant to support our educational outreach programs. And we're very pleased to receive this and have the recognition of our programs as a mark of excellence that the National Endowment for Humanities supports. So I urge you to visit Northampton, Historic Northampton rather, in person, or go online at www.historic-northampton.org. Learn about our education programs, our world-class exhibits, extensive collections, and to remember, as we celebrate this 350th anniversary, after this anniversary year is over, it's Historic Northampton that will continue to preserve and interpret the historical legacy of our community as it has for almost a century. So it's crucial that we build our membership base to match the quality of our programs as we move ahead. So in the spirit of Jonathan Edwards, I want to move you to quicken your conscience, to become a member of Historic Northampton. You can do that today. You can do that right now. We're not going to ask you to walk down the aisle. And in Edwards' day, he would have passed the plate, would have taken this opportunity to do that, and everybody could see how much you put in. And also in Edwards' day, we're a little bit more egalitarian. Those members of the congregation who took stewardship the most seriously got to sit up close, up to the front. So in the privacy of your own conscience, you'll have the opportunity to become a member of Historic Northampton. If you look in your program, there's a card that you can fill out and tear out and either send in or return to those who are at the table in the foyer. We urge you to take a look at some of the materials there. And we hope that you'll become a supporter and a member of Historic Northampton and enjoy all the benefits that a membership brings. I also want to remind you that these lectures, along with other articles, will be collected in an anthology and published with the University of Massachusetts Press, a place called Paradise, Culture and Community in Northampton, Massachusetts, 1654 to 2004, will be published late this year at the close of our anniversary celebration. You can reserve a copy of this book by also looking in your program. You can fill out the enclosed card and drop it by at the table or send it into Historic Northampton. And if you're watching on cable TV, you can call 584-6011 to reserve your copy. And Jonathan Edwards is often caricatured as the stern Puritan who preached fire and brimstone sermons such as his notorious Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Yet, Edwards was also America's preeminent genius of the 18th century. Besides being a moving force in the Great Awakening, Edwards was a relentless speculative scientist, an acute psychologist, a world-famous theologian, and America's most prominent philosopher. And today it's my pleasure to welcome Ron Story as our speaker on Jonathan Edwards and the Gospel of Love. Ron is professor of history at the University of Massachusetts. He is a distinguished contributor to the scholarship of American social history. His interests have ranged from the 1919 Black Sox scandal to the Boston Brahmins. It's not a team, by the way. Not a bad name for one. And Ron has most recently served as with distinction I might add, and courage, as the president of the Massachusetts Society of Professors. So he spent his time in purgatory, and we welcome him today to a place called Paradise to share his thoughts about Jonathan Edwards.
Thanks very much. This is a terrific turnout given the weather, I must say. This makes Northamptonites seem even more gritty to me. And I appreciate the fact that Carrie has, as it were, passed the collection plate here. It kind of gets us in the mood for what I'm going to talk about today. I was scalded by the ferocious wind as I was walking over here, and it did make me appreciate the squabbles that Jonathan Edwards sometimes had with the town about his salary, because one of the things that was in the salary package was firewood, and you just have to walk across the Smith campus to appreciate the significance of that today. Jonathan Edwards is by now almost certainly Northampton's most illustrious resident. A Yale graduate and the grandson of Solomon Stoddard, who had filled the Northampton pulpit with power and distinction for several decades. Edwards was already reasonably well known when at age 23, he became pastor of the town's Congregational Church in 1727. But he soon made his own mark. Within a few years, he was one of the foremost preachers of New England. He played a signal role in fomenting the religious enthusiasms known as the Great Awakening, which may be said to have begun in its 18th century form right here in Northampton. He then produced numerous pamphlets and polemics that described, defended, and critiqued the Awakening. In 1741, Edwards preached the most famous of all American sermons, which Carrie mentioned, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. He built up a correspondence with British divines that spread his fame, and he wrote. By 1751, when he relinquished his pulpit, he had published 7 significant theological and pastoral volumes, plus many sermons and other pieces. Other theological treatises would appear before his death of smallpox at Princeton in 1758. Edwards' influence as a thinker and preacher was formidable for the next 150 years. His biography of the young David Brainerd was one of the most popular books of the 19th century. His great work, Freedom of the Will, was a major influence on generations of theologians, as was his evangelical example on generations of revivalists. New editions of his writings appeared at least every 15 years, nor has the pace slackened of late. After a slump in the early 20th century, the last 50 years, and especially the last 30 years, have witnessed an avalanche of biographies, critical studies, literary appreciations, and a major new edition of his collected writings from Yale University Press, which now stands at 22 volumes, each with a full panoply of modern scholarly and editorial support. The historical profession, the whole Protestant world, and to some degree Christendom itself, know of Jonathan Edwards and therefore of Northampton. But if Edwards is the best known of Northamptonites, he is also the most protean and multifaceted. Perry Miller, whose 1949 biography of Edwards inaugurated the recent wave of study, saw him as the quintessential lonely intellectual, a frontier pastor nurtured in the Calvinist tradition who also read John Locke and Isaac Newton, who saw the need to reconcile their insights into Calvinist precepts, and spent his life attempting to do precisely that. Having lived through a ghastly global depression and ghastlier global war, Perry Miller admired Edwards' skepticism about the banal American faith in intrinsic goodness and inevitable progress. A Harvard scholar awash in a culture of Babbittry and materialism, Miller also admired Edwards as an exemplar of the life of the mind against all odds, struggling for understanding, grappling with non-utilitarian ultimate questions. And it must be said that Miller seemed especially impressed that Edwards led the life of the mind in a hick town like Northampton, rather than in, for example, Cambridge. Despite many revisions, this view of Edwards has largely endured. The modern Yale edition of his writings treats him first and foremost as a thinker and scholar. In the words of George Marston, his latest and finest biographer, Edwards challenges the common sense view of our culture that the material world is the real world. Marston goes on to call Edwards' effort to reconcile Augustinian themes with a post-Newtonian universe breathtaking. Others have admired not Edwards the intellectual, but Edwards the Calvinist, the last Puritan, struggling to uphold the cardinal doctrines of the faith of the fathers: God's omnipotence, original sin, Christ's atonement, the absolute primacy of Scripture, free grace through the influx of the Holy Spirit, and sanctification. It was to preserve and protect this set of beliefs that Edwards tried to reconcile Calvinism with Enlightenment thought. He spent much of his life fighting both Arminians, the Boston-centered pastors who increasingly preach salvation through good works and human will, thereby denigrating God's power. The implication of that is that you can earn your own grace, and if you can earn it, God's not all powerful. He also argued against antinomians, the revival-inspired pastors who preach salvation through emotional experience, thereby denigrating God's expectation of saintly behavior. To the Arminians, writes William Breitenbach in a useful formulation, Edwards said that virtue to be true must be gracious. It must be full of grace. To the antinomians, he said that grace to be true must be virtuous, full of virtue. This rigorous Calvinism, its biblicism, hostility to priestly hierarchy, opposition to earning one's way to heaven through alms, accounts in part for Edwards' pronounced anti-Catholicism. Repugnant though it is to non-believers, including Perry Miller, and those religious seeking a God of compassion and warmth, it was precisely Edwards' devotion to this unflinching doctrine that earned him the presidency of the College of New Jersey, Princeton, just before his death, and that appealed to so many 19th century followers and neo-orthodox of our own time. A sympathetic scholar calls him the most imposing apologist for Calvinism and human depravity in the United States intellectual history. Edwards the intellectual, Edwards the Calvinist, but also and perhaps foremost Edwards the evangelist, progenitor of American revivalism. This persona has two sources: his role in fomenting the Great Awakening, which he described and analyzed in detail, and his extraordinary sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. His famous contemporary, John Wesley, whose Methodist followers set the American back country on fire in the 19th century, read Edwards' account of the Northampton Awakenings, followed their progress, imitated their methods, and acknowledged Edwards as one of the fountainheads of Protestant revivalism. So did Charles G. Finney, Presbyterian architect of the Second Great Awakening in the early 19th century, who spoke of Edwards's evangelical writings with rapture and called him a great man who was famous in his day for new measures such as the physical agony of prayer and a reliance on lay exhorters. These claims were much exaggerated. I don't actually find very much of that in the real Edwards, but there's some of that. They do suggest Edwards's reach across the years, as do, this is an astonishing number, 171,000 copies of Edwards on colonial revivals that the American Tract Society distributed between 1833 and 1875. Can you believe that? For the 19th century evangelicals, Edwards was, in Joseph Conforti's words, the father of the Great Awakening and of American revivalism, an embodiment of a lofty standard of evangelical piety. And while Wesley and Finney preached the un-Edwardsian doctrine of free will, Calvinists even of our own day flocked to Edwards's evangelical banner, explaining the great waves of American revivalism, including that of Edwards, as the consequence not of historical conditions, but of the workings of the Holy Spirit. As for the sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, its fame is vast. It was an awakening sermon of a type that New England ministers preached from time to time to remind dull parishioners how God's anger was ever present and of the reality and danger of hell. People did back then believe in hell. The sermon showed how sin would doom everyone to eternal damnation except for the pleasure of God to keep them from it. And here's just a brief quote. The God that holds you over the pit of hell, much as one holds a spider or some loathsome insect over the fire, abhors you and is dreadfully provoked. His wrath towards you burns like fire. He looks upon you as worthy of nothing else but to be cast into the fire. He is of purer eyes than to bear to have you in his sight. You are 10,000 times more abominable in his eyes than the most hateful, venomous serpent is in ours. O sinner, consider the fearful danger you are in. This was a 2-hour sermon, by the way. Implacable and terrible imagery and message. Before the sermon was done, wrote one attendee, there was a great moaning and crying out through the whole house. I noticed none of you cried out, so this shows the difference. What shall I do to be saved? Oh, I'm going to hell. Oh, what shall I do for Christ? Such shrieks and cries arose that Edwards had to ask for silence to continue. It was pure terror preaching, deliberately designed to coerce the wicked back to pious behavior and fear of the Lord. Isaac Watts, who printed the sermon in Britain, called it a most terrible sermon, which should have had a word of gospel at the end of it. And even some of Edwards's modern admirers consider it infamous. Even so, it became much beloved of generations of hellfire revivalists who used versions of it to terrify guilt-ridden congregations into getting right with God. And I must say that I was brought up as a Southern Baptist. You might be able to hear that in my twang. And I heard versions of this sermon. We have then Edwards as intellectual, Edwards as Calvinist, Edwards as evangelist. We also have Edwards as scold, which plunges us squarely into the middle of colonial Northampton. The primary duty of a Puritan minister was to correct the sinful ways of his parishioners. They expected it, and Edwards, with his belief in original sin, high standards of piety and propriety, and his willingness to invoke the threat of damnation, did not disappoint them. 3 episodes make the point. In 1737, Northampton built a new meeting house. Previously, church officers assigned seats according to age, estate, and usefulness, unquote, usefulness, community service, military rank, and the like. In the new building, pews were assigned after some controversy principally by wealth, which implied, says Patricia Tracy, that property was more respectable than old age and worldly achievement more laudable than experience as a humble Christian. Edwards disagreed with this new dispensation, preached against the contentiousness and pride that underlay it, and warned the congregation, quote, "Consider it is but a very little while before it will all be one to you, whether you have sat higher or low." In 1744, some girls in town told Edwards that young men had been reading a midwifery book, joking about the explicit descriptions and diagrams and taunting the girls for being nasty creatures. Long concerned about the potential waywardness of Northampton youth, about, for example, night frolics and lascivious behavior, Edwards now preached against this instance of lewd sinfulness, then read a list of the names of the miscreants publicly from the pulpit. 3 of them openly resisted his and the church's authority. One said that he would not worship a wig and cared not a turd or a fart for the church authorities. You can see modern America. Edwards afterwards expended much time and energy addressing such disrespect and corruption. Again in 1744, Edwards quarreled with the town about arrears in his salary. Only after bitter debates did the taxpayers agree to settle and fix the salary according to certain commodity prices. Edwards had a large family and many visitors. More urgently, he believed that the minister should have elevated status in any community calling itself Christian, and that it was anti-ministerial and therefore anti-spiritual to withhold salary. He naturally said so both in Northampton and when preaching to surrounding congregations about their own ministers. In all 3 cases, the community was reflecting long-term American trends. Stratification in the Pew controversy, landless youth beyond parental control in the dirty book episode, secularism in the salary squab. Edwards saw them all as expressions of impiety and did his ministerial duty to scold. But Edwards was more than just intellectual, Calvinist, evangelical, and scold. He was these, but to stop here would be misleading as to his full nature and the fullness of his mission in Northampton. For example, he preached far less about fire, as in his notorious sinners' sermons, than about light. This metaphor was common among New England divines who stressed saving grace through the influx of the Holy Spirit. But Edwards, who knew his Newton and had been curious about optics as a boy, carried it to special heights. Jesus Christ, the light of the world, 1723, was a poetic early effort. His first important published sermon in 1734 was a divine and supernatural light, immediately imparted to the soul by the Spirit of God. Followed shortly by, among others, Jesus Christ is the shining forth of the Father's glory, false light and true light in a dark world, a dark heart. Unlike fire, light connotes sight and insight, brightness and illumination. Frequently in Edwards' sermons, something of sweetness and even rapture, personal and collective hope, rather than anxiety and dread. And light connoted Christ. That beauteous light with which the world is filled on a clear day is a lively shadow of Jesus Christ's spotless holiness and happiness. A brief passage from a 1744 ordination sermon in the poor country village of Pelham, just east of Northampton, might serve to convey just how stunning Edwards' light preaching could be. Note the imagery and the rhythm of the language. When divine light and heat attend each other in ministers of the gospel, their light will be like the beams of the sun that do not only convey light but give life. And converts will be likely to spring up under their ministry as the grass and the plants of the field under the influences of the sun. And the souls of the saints will be likely to grow and appear beautiful as the lily, and to revive as the corn, and grow as the vine, and their scent to be as the wine of Lebanon, and their light will be like to the light of Christ, which is the light of life. That's quite beautiful. That's real poetry. This was presumably a sermon of less consequence to Edwards because not delivered in a significant place, either Northampton or another notable venue. It was more or less tossed off, making its power and beauty all the more remarkable and leaving an entirely different impression from the awful fire and brimstone sinner sermons. No one, says George Marsden, looked more intensely at the biblical meaning of light for his day than did Edwards. The standard representations of Edwards likewise fail to capture the importance of beauty for him. This too was everywhere in his thought, preaching, and writing, and at every level from the ordinary to the sublime. Early on he found the physical world, nature in the woods or fields, the stars at night, thunderclouds by day, rainbows, flowers, beautiful in its own right. That sort of beauty which is called natural as of vines, plants, trees, etc., consists of a very complicated harmony. And all the natural motions and tendencies and figures of bodies in the universe are done according to proportion, and therein is their beauty. He appreciated the sweetness of honey, the harmonies of music, the excellences of a building that could, like grace, be the excellence of a building and like the countenance, grace, and shape of a person, be beautiful. His wife Sarah, after all, was reputed to be one of the beauties of the Connecticut Valley, a view that her portrait supports. Edwards wrote of a beautiful body, a lovely proportion, a beautiful harmony of features of face, delightful airs of countenance and voice, and sweet motion and gesture, all, I'm sure, with Sarah in mind. So too with fine mental work. There was something he noted in the ideas and conceptions of great philosophers and statesmen that may be called beautiful, and I don't doubt that he thought that of theologians as well. Music deserves a word of its own. Edwards always loved music, especially harmony of voices. One of his major British correspondents was Isaac Watts, whose popular new hymns Edwards helped introduce to the Connecticut Valley churches in place of the cacophonous and discordant psalmody that still characterized provincial services. He and Sarah loved to sing, and he thought people could communicate best through music. The best, most beautiful, and most perfect way that we have of expressing a sweet concord of mind to each other is by music. When I would form in my mind an idea of a society in the highest degree happy, I think of them as expressing their love, their joy, the inward concord and harmony and spiritual beauty of their souls by sweetly singing together. He preached on the sweet harmony of Christ amidst the early Northampton awakening, held singing meetings, and in one of his most affecting sermons rhapsodized at length about the new song that Christ teaches, and that the saints will sing together with Christ in heaven. This must draw your heart and put it into tune and fill it with love and joy, which is the excellent harmony and heavenly melody of the soul. He used singing in Stockbridge among his Indian pupils, following his dismissal from his pulpit for the same reason he fostered it in Northampton, because sacred music has a powerful efficacy to soften the heart into tenderness and to harmonize the affections. But music, like other forms of worldly beauty and like light, gave a mere glimpse of the spiritual harmonies that accompanied grace. Natural beauties, Edwards insisted, only point to those higher spiritual excellencies. The beauty of human love was limited compared to that between Christ and his saints, where new beauties are continually discovered, and more loveliness, and in which we shall forever increase in beauty ourselves. In The Nature of True Virtue, one of his major treatises, he equates virtue with something beautiful, or rather some kind of beauty or excellence. Virtue, he says, is the beauty of the qualities and exercises of the heart, or of those actions which proceed from them. And the less self-contained and more general the beauty, the closer it comes to the whole universal system of excellence, so that to love beauty of this vast and general kind, whose traits are consent and agreement rather than discord and dissent, is to love benevolence to everything and all. Such disinterested benevolence is the essence of virtue. And since such beauty stems from and is coterminous with the divine being, virtue is ultimately absolute love of the infinite beauty of God and his works and creatures. Consciousness of self is a natural part of the beautiful whole, therefore validating self-love. So it's all right to love yourself. But genuine virtue, he concludes, prevents that increase of the habits of pride and sensuality, habits that were a special preoccupation of the Northampton years. The principle of general benevolence that Edwards spins out from his notions of the infinite beauties of God and God's world instead softens and sweetens the mind and makes it susceptible of proper influence. What he saw around him needed, at the very least, in his view, softening and sweetening. Beauty, in any case, is the key concept for Edwards on virtue, as it was a leitmotif in his life. Light, beauty, but also, and even more, charity. No virtue was more important to Jonathan Edwards than charity. His grandfather Stoddard had been known as a minister of the poor and the lowly. The grandson followed suit. They that do good to others, Edwards preached, shall be rewarded, whether to their souls or bodies. Doing good to other souls was obviously a priority. They that do good to others, outward man, shall not lose their reward, especially in ways of charity to the poor. He that gives to the poor lends to the Lord. No one claiming to be a Christian should be backward and straight-handed toward his poor brethren, but should abound in deeds of charity and perform them with cheerfulness and joyfulness. Charity and justice, argued Edwards, citing the Sermon on the Mount and the dicta of Paul and of John the Baptist, always trumped external worship as a virtue. Bowing or kneeling before God is of no use except as a sign of inner reverence. Not so with charity. The Christian's duty to the widow, the fatherless, the stranger, and the poor, which is always significant in itself, for it is to do good. In a sermon on the occasion of a call for donations to support Northampton's poor, he preached the sermon actually just before he preached the famous sinner's sermon, which suggests to me a link between stinginess and prospect of eternal damnation. Edwards showcased the generosity of the Virgin Mary, which should inform public contributions for pious and charitable uses. Edwards himself gave much, though usually anonymously, and by his will ordered what remained of his estate after obligations and expenses distributed to charitable causes. When charity was insufficient or niggardly, Edwards was not loath to chastise his parishioners. He scolded them for this more than he did for being licentious. Although no leveler, Edwards was uncomfortable with the increasingly individualistic, acquisitive, modern culture that characterized New England, including Northampton. He believed that free enterprise brought out the worst in human nature. Greedily hoarding up material wealth seemed unchristian, an impediment to spirituality, and an obstacle to charity. Property alone would avail nothing. Only the Holy Spirit, arriving through undeserved free grace, could get people to heaven. The best use of property would be to help the meek, the brokenhearted, the captive, the imprisoned, plus, to be sure, one's own minister, to free him from worldly cares. Should the great ones of a congregation not respond, they should be chastised for wickedness and sin. He assailed magistrates who were governed by their private interests, buying and selling places of public trust for private gain, and merchants who took advantage of poor indigent people, thus committing the violent sin of oppression. He assailed wicked, debauched men who conducted their business out of covetousness and pride. I'm not sure what he thought people conducted business out of, if not covetousness, but this is what he said. By what measure should we judge Christian behavior? By how many poor there are in a place. And how many would that be? None. Towns had not done enough if there were any objects of charity suffering and pinching want. Rich men should give away 1/4 of their estates, and even that would be only a little in the eyes of God. For though Christ is not on earth, yet he has left others in his room to be his receivers, and they are the poor. God hath been pleased to make our needy neighbors his receivers. In 1742, Edwards drew up a town covenant for his parishioners to sign. They promised, among other things, not to overreach or defraud their neighbor or cheat him, and not to rest till we have made that restitution or given that satisfaction which the rules of moral equity require. Even Perry Miller, who was no admirer of commercial civilization, calls this a hard oath for an expanding economy to observe. In 1743, Edwards persuaded his congregation, and remember, there's only one church in Northampton in the 1740s. This is it. This is tantamount to the whole town. Persuaded the congregation to collect funds for the poor at every Sabbath service, and he urged a public stock, that is to say, an early welfare system for the poor. His message on charity, therefore, had significance for what passed then for public policy. As one model, he held up a pietist German whose stress on charity had produced invaluable orphanages and schools for poor children. Similarly, rich men should establish and support schools in poor towns and villages in Massachusetts. Charity, moreover, implied not only succor for the needy, but reaching out and even incorporating them into the fold of the parish. This too had started with Stoddard, the grandfather, who criticized how congregations admitted the children of members to communion automatically, but required newcomers and outsiders, many of them poor, to narrate their conversion experiences. Reaching out to the excluded was a hallmark of the Great Awakening, in which Northampton played a vital part. Edwards reflected that intent in his ministry. God's grace could descend on anybody, high or low. They that are not much accounted of, you see that your judgment of things is not much regarded. What you say in conversation is not much so taken notice of. Your voice is not so much heard as others in public affairs. Do not be dismayed. Christ himself, when he was upon earth, confined himself to your condition. He did not appear in the world in the circumstances of a man of note, but in the state of the poor and despised. He was of low parentage. His mother was a woman of low degree. Her husband, Joseph, was an obscure person. Which groups would this doctrine have touched in the mid-18th century? Those without power. You okay? Good. It's probably an Anglican working with you. Those without place, including those without a voice and a vote in town and church affairs. The socially marginal. Youth without property and family as yet, and perhaps especially women. Urging the town worms of high state. He loved to use that word. It's interesting. The worms. People with a lot of money. Worms. High station and property to be inclusive. He preached, if one worm be a little exalted above another by having more dust or a bigger dunghill, what a distance does he keep from those that are below him? Christ condescends to wash our feet. How would great men, or rather the bigger worms, account themselves debased by acts of far less condescension? When Northampton voted to dismiss Edwards in 1751, only male church members voted, and not all of those. Edwards himself wrote afterwards that many more, especially women and youths, would have supported him if they dared. Charity involved inclusion as well as giving and fairness. So light, beauty, charity. So see, I'm trying to build a new image of Jonathan Edwards, and it's real, it's true. And underlying everything, and above all else, love. Whatever his reputation, Jonathan Edwards was a powerful preacher of the gospel of love. This is almost never acknowledged or discussed, presumably because he also believed in depravity and the terrors of hell, and he frequently said so. But the Edwards of love leaps from the pages of his great work, Charity in Its Fruits, which expands upon a group of sermons he preached throughout much of the year 1738. These were commentaries on verses from 1 Corinthians, one of Edwards' favorite books of the New Testament. The sermons do two things. They instruct us to lead loving Christian lives in this world as best we can. And they offer us a picture and a definition of heaven as a place of pure love. Edwards urged his congregation in their daily lives to an imitation of Christ. Christ loved his enemies, Edwards says, Jews, Samaritans, and Romans, as well as Christians. He loved people so much that he felt one with them. He made them a part of his flesh and his bone. He so loved us all that he gave everything he had and became poor for us and traded ease and honor for suffering and degradation. Christ loved us as he loved the poor, the maimed, the halt, the blind, the empty and needy and vagabond, without ever expecting to be repaid. He was, in spite of the great injuries done to him, altogether meek and gentle. And so, preached Edwards, should we love. Christian love, he said, is contrary to a selfish spirit. We must consider not only our own circumstances and necessities, but those of our neighbors. Regard not only our own desires, but others' desires too. We should love even those of hateful dispositions, even the proud, the greedy, the hard, the profane, and the unjust. We should not only help the poor, we should do it lovingly, with our hand wide open, and with a charitable heart, expecting nothing in return. Christian love will dispose us to mercy toward a neighbor who suffers affliction or calamity. We will in this way bear one another's burdens and weep with those that weep. It is love, moreover, said Edwards, that will check and restrain bitterness and heated spirits and prevent broils and quarrels. Love will help us to suppress wrath, rage, resentment, revenge, and bitterness, and all the monstrous passions that stir up hatred and strife and violence. We do not live in heaven, or a world of purity, innocence, and love, Edwards wrote. We dwell in a fallen, corrupt, miserable, wicked world full of malice and injury. Even so, Christian love will dispose us to peace. Most people know Jonathan Edwards for his preaching on the fiery terrors of hell, as in the Sinner's Sermons, but this great series of love sermons, Charity and Its Fruits, coming between the mini awakening of the mid-1730s and the larger awakening of the early 1740s, and immediately after the New Meeting House controversy, enabled Edwards to define hell more precisely. Hell, he argued, is a place where there is no love. It is a place deluged not with fire, but with wrath and hatred and rage, a place of pride and contention and strife, spite, treachery, fickleness, hypocrisy, and deceit, without friendship, pity, or mercy. It may be the best definition of hell any minister ever offered, I must say. It's changed the way I think about it. It really has. Hell is the place without love. Once heard, it's a difficult definition to forget. Heaven, by contrast, is a world of perfect love. Edwards showed us his vision of heaven in the last of these great sermons on Corinthians, entitled, Heaven is a World of Love. In heaven, said Edwards, we may love God, Christ, and one another perfectly, without envy or malice or revenge or contempt or selfishness. In heaven, no one will ever be grieved that they are slighted by those they love. Nor will the joy of heavenly love be interrupted by jealousy. Heavenly lovers, in Edwards' words, will have no doubt of the love of each other. All their expressions of love shall come from the bottom of their hearts. In heaven, there will be nothing to clog the exercise and expression of love. No heavy body or lump of flesh or unfit organ or inadequate tongue. We shall have no difficulty expressing our love. Our souls, like a flame of fire with love, shall not be like a fire pent up, but shall be perfectly at liberty, winged with love, with no weight tied to the feet to hinder their flight. Nor will there be any wall of separation to prevent the perfect enjoyment of each other's love. Neither physical distance nor want of full acquaintance or misunderstanding nor disunion through difference of temperament or circumstance or opinion, interest. We shall all be united, related to Christ, the head of the whole society, the spouse, in Edwards' words, of the whole church of saints, which shall be a single family. As love seeks to have the beloved for its own, so in heaven all shall have property in one another. The saints shall be God's, preached Edwards, and he theirs. And so with Christ, who bought them with his life and gave himself to them in death. The saints shall be one another's, and they shall enjoy each other's love in perfect and undisturbed prosperity, without adversity or pitiful grief of spirit, and shall glory in the possession of all things in common. And heaven will be a garden of pleasure, paradise, fit in all respects for an abode of heavenly lovers, where they may have sweet society. The very light which shines in and fills the world, that world is the light of love, said Edwards. It is beams of love, for it is the shining of the glory of the Lamb of God. That most wonderful influence of lamb-like meekness and love which fills the heavenly Jerusalem with light. And we will know such perfect love forever, with no fear that such happiness will ever end. All things, Edwards preached, shall flourish in an eternal youth. Age will not diminish anyone's beauty or vigor, and their love shall flourish in everyone's breast, as a living spring perpetually springing, or as a flame which never fails. And the holy pleasure shall be as a river which ever runs, and is always clear and full. There shall be no autumn or winter. Every plant shall be in perpetual bloom with the same undecaying pleasantness and fragrance, always springing forth, always blossoming, and always bearing fruit. He concluded, "Oh, what tranquility there is in such a world as this! Who can express the sweetness of this peace? What a calm is this! What a haven of rest is here to arrive at after persons have gone through a world of storms and tempests, a world of pride and selfishness, and envy and malice and scorn, contempt, contention, and war. What a Canaan of rest." Jonathan Edwards did not believe that we could find perfection in this world. If hell is hatred and heaven pure love, this world is a mixture. To find true and perfect love, you have to enter heaven, which will only come through grace. But he ended this magnificent sermon by telling us that as heaven is a world of love, so the way to heaven is the way of love. This will prepare you for heaven and make you ready for an inheritance with the saints in that land of light and love. And if ever you arrive at heaven, faith and love must be the wings that carry you there. Few biographers consider the charity sermons. Ola Winslow, Perry Miller, Patricia Tracy do not mention them at all. Other biographers give them 3 or 4 paragraphs. One reason may be that they did not appear in print until the 19th century. Perhaps another that they were so at odds with Edwards' conventional image. But Paul Ramsey, the editor of the Yale volume that contains Charity and its Fruits, is right to argue that this is a mistake that makes it harder to understand Edwards as a whole. At the very least, it shows him employing a positive inducement, heaven and perfect love, to holiness, as well as a negative one, hell and eternal agony. There is the pull of love as well as the push of fear to turn one to grace and sanctification. It also adds emotional substance and tangible imagery to the abstract reasoning of other works, for example, the nature of true virtue. And it draws our attention to a utopian strain of Edwards' thought, a means of resolving the thorny problems of acquisitiveness and lust and strife, all of which melt together in the collective ownership, complex marriage, and mutual adoration of the heavenly community of the loving Christ. Human depravity notwithstanding, one can discern here the inspirational seeds, not only of Finneyite revivalism, but of that other spiritual blossom of the 19th century, the perfectionism of John Humphrey Noyes. Lastly, the final sermon in the series, Heaven is a World of Love, gives us a piece easily equal in rhetorical power and brilliance to Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Wilson Kimnack notes this sermon's Dantean simplicity, scope, and grandeur, and speculates that Sinners has stolen the day for the same sensationalist reasons that the Inferno has clipped the Paradiso. Pain is more riveting than grace. Which is a pity. It's a pity. It's a shame. Heaven is suffused with light and beauty and charity and love, indispensable attributes of the real Jonathan Edwards. When heaven appears in as many anthologies as Sinners, we will be closer to grasping what he meant to Northampton and the Connecticut Valley in his time and ours. And I want to end this with just a little something I do with the bas relief in First Churches that some people may have seen. There's a bronze tablet, the bas relief, Jonathan Edwards, hanging on the right wall of the meeting house of the First Churches of Northampton. If you go in the front door, you see it over on the right. Crafted by Herbert Adams and unveiled in 1900, exactly 150 years after Edwards' dismissal from his church for withholding sacraments to unjustified, in Edwards' eyes, supplicants. The bas-relief captures much of the conventional wisdom about Edwards, the high forehead of the aloof intellectual, the judging eyes of the fearsome preacher, the lofty, bewigged, unapproachable minister. When the congregation comes into the sanctuary, I've noticed this, for Sunday service, members drift almost always over onto the left side, away from the formidable visage on the wall. There are doubtless many reasons why people drift in this direction, not least habit, but it seems likely that they are resistant, if only subconsciously, to experiencing the stare of a figure who seems perhaps ready to scold them. As well he might, should he come suddenly to life once more. But the sculpture is misleading. If you look at the picture of Joseph Badger on which the sculpture is based, the only portrait we have of Edwards, you see an open face and a level gaze. There's no smile. The great divines of New England did not smile. Being liked was not a particular virtue in America until very recently. Certainly not among these people. God did not put them on the earth to be liked. But the eyes of Edwards in the picture are youthful and almost tender, the face modest, almost vulnerable. It's actually the way the bas-relief is lighted from the top. The light is up here shining down over the sculpture. And the deep cuts that the sculptor uses to capture the likeness, to make the eyes appear dark, glowering and judgmental, and the visage stern and lofty. The impression is not exactly wrong. It simply exaggerates certain features at the expense of others, such as the open and inviting right hand at the lower left, reaching to touch us. The real Jonathan Edwards, the Edwards of heaven, is a world of love, as well as Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, is like the wall sculpture. It's the lighting that history has thrown on him that makes him seem so daunting. If you look closely, you see not only the shadowy, judging eyes, but the warm, loving hand. Thanks very much.
We'll open the floor to questions in just a minute. Give Ron a chance to catch his breath. And I just want to point out that this lecture series is part of a year-long celebration of Northampton's 350th anniversary, and there have been a lot of folks working on different aspects of this celebration all along. And today we have Susan Well here, who's co-chair of the 350th celebration for the city, and I'm going to ask her if she would like a chance to talk about some upcoming programs.
Thank you. I'm just really going to say that the programs that we're sponsoring between now and the next lecture series are in the program, today's program guide on our advertising page. And if you want more information, you can go to our website, gazettenet.com/350. And this Wednesday, you should pick up a Valley Advocate, which has an insert with the entire calendar between now and May. And in the end, last week in May, they'll be publishing the second half, the calendar for the second half of the year. So it's really easy to find out. It's beginning to be really easy to find out what programs we have available. You'll also find that some of our merchandise is in and available at Souvenirs and Stuff and at some of our programs. And we would really appreciate it if you bought all the t-shirts and baseball caps that you could possibly use.
Thank you, Susan. I also want to recognize David Stevens, who's back there, who's also co-chair of the 350th. Thank you for David's good work. I look forward to these programs. I also wanted just to remind you, as they're in your program, that this series of lectures will take place every month throughout the anniversary year. Our next lecture will be on February the 15th, and our featured speaker will be Princeton historian Nell Irvin Painter, whose acclaimed biography of Sojourner Truth, Sojourner Truth, A Life Symbol, was published just a few years ago. And I urge you to attend this lecture. Interestingly enough, as Ron pointed out, that essentially Sojourner Truth is a legacy of Edwards and the Great Awakening, and is a good example of, during this time, how the reform ideology that Sojourner Truth espoused, abolitionism and so forth, was really coming out of the Great Awakening, but taking this notion that good works can bring about a heavenly kingdom on earth. So we look forward to that and hope to see you all there. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Ron, and he will call on you if you have some questions.
Okay, I'm open. Questions? Sure.
Ron, I attended a performance by a person at College Church, and she portrayed Sarah Edwards. And it was really interesting. I felt a couple of things that I got out of that was that Sarah reported that in the last 4 years that he was in Northampton, not one new member joined the church. And, well, you sort of alluded to that he had refused to admit certain people, I guess. And that probably had something to do with his downfall. Plus, she told us this a lighter story that back in those days, the day of the week that your child was born, say on a Tuesday, was exactly the same day as it was conceived. And that children born on Sunday indicated that people were engaging in pleasures and were somewhat considered to be not quite religious. She said that 4 of her children were born on Sunday. So she had to live with this fact all her life.
Well, Edwards had a lot of children. It was one of the larger families in the Connecticut Valley. I think she bore 15 children. So I would say New England families were large then, much larger than they are now. But my sense is that they had a vigorous and active sexual life, and it wasn't just for procreation. There was more to it than that. I also don't remember an enormous number of sermons in which Edwards chastised people for being affectionate on Sunday. I don't remember that. It doesn't seem to have been a major part of his concern. He did chastise people for doing other things, doing business, for example. So it's an interesting point, but I don't remember that being a big part of the way it was. There is a book, if people are interested in this subject, about how Puritans really behaved, how people in colonial New England really behaved. I can't remember the guy's name, but the book is called Puritans at Play. Puritans at Play. And it's quite a delightful study. They were much more relaxed than you would think, right? They were much more relaxed than you would think. So I guess I would, that's an interesting story, but I'm not sure that it really works so much for Edwards. The no new members point in the last 4 years, he was in bad odor with the town the last 4 years because he had begun, not only because of all these arguments that he had with people, but because he had started to refuse communion to people. And unless he believed that they were truly justified, justified means you have experienced saving grace, the influx of the Holy Spirit. How did you know that people were justified? It is that you could see the results, which is sanctification. And my sense is that Edwards decided to deny the sacraments to people because they were not behaving in a Christian way, which is what a lot of the sermons that he preaches in the late 1730s and 40s are all about. If you really were Christians, you would be behaving in a different way. You would be A, less licentious, and B, you'd be less interested in money and more interested in the church and spirituality. So, in some ways, this was an attack on the establishment of the town, even though he was a part of it. It was an attack on the establishment of the town. And it did put him in bad odor for a long time with members of the church. Yes?
I hesitate to look for a fly in the ointment.
Yes.
I read in just yesterday's Gazette about the fact that many of the ministers of that period had slaves. I wonder, first of all, whether there was ever a modern sanctity whether he ever slave master.
He did. He had a slave. He did speak about it, but not very much. He had a slave, at least briefly. It was given to him. The woman was given to him, and the slave was disposed of sometime later. The woman may have been sold. I don't know. He never preached against the institution of slavery that I know of. It was not a significant part of his thinking, clearly. He was not Samuel Sewall, the Code of Joseph. He was not so concerned about it. He did write a long letter attacking slave trade on the grounds that we were tearing people away from their family homes and their families. It was not fair and unjust and oppressive. So my guess would be that once people started to talk about and focus on slavery, he would have probably, I'm guessing, he probably would have moved in the direction of abolition because that was part of his consciousness. But it wasn't an issue. It wasn't an issue. That's a good point. And I don't mean to suggest, by the way, that Edwards was perfect. Far from it. I admire some parts of him, but it was not perfect. Yes?
I was wondering what other churches or religious institutions might have been operative in the area. I know the Congregational Church is on it. Were there other congregational ministers around about? Were there other denominations that might have had an active engagement?
There were other congregational church, there were other ministers in other parishes. Nearly all of them in this area were congregational. If you look at the old maps of the founding of the towns and how they developed, you will see from time to time buildings right next to the streams and rivers and the little squares. And right next to those squares is written Baptist. And the Baptists are next to the creeks. Why? Does anybody know that? Because they have to be dunked. Right? You have to be dunked under the water. So you can start to see that in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. I do not know I don't think there were any Anglican churches in this area. I think they were all in Boston. So when we talk about the church, it's a congregational church. That's it. That's why I said that when Edwards said something about how we should treat the poor, It was a public policy statement. This is how the town, and not just this congregation. And he, by the way, got his money from taxes. It was an established church. He did not actually pass the collection plate. That would have been demeaning to a minister of the Lord. Yes?
I'm writing a novel about Jonathan Edwards, and I really appreciate your emphasis on honey and light, you know. And I would add writer to that list of identities, because he's an amazing writer. He really is. And I also wanted to say that his son was a very early abolitionist, so there was that influence. But he, of course, I have a question about sinners in the hands of an angry God. There was an incident that happened, I think, in March of 1736, while they were building the new meeting house, where the gallery of the current meeting house came crashing down on the congregation while he was preaching. He had just, said quite a scripture about falling to the pit of hell or something like that, and bam, all the people fell down on the whole congregation. Many were injured, but nobody died. And he wrote about it in a way that was published in the Boston paper. So it was a well-known incident, and that incident was included in the British publication of A Fateful Narrative, the publication about the early Northampton revival. And I've always wondered if the way sinners in the hands of an angry God was received, the way people were screaming and shrieking while he was talking about sliding into the pit of hell, had to do with people's, knowing that this thing that had happened while he was in the midst of the sermon, that people had actually, faced death or been seriously injured. The church had sort of, fallen apart while he was preaching. What do you think about that? Do you think there could be any
Puritan ministers loved it when that sort of thing happened.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely loved it, because they could go for weeks talking about the significance of that. I really think that the sinner sermon terrified people so much because on some level, everybody knows that they're sinners. If you read the things that you would get rid of in heaven, heaven is a world of love. If you go through the list of things, there's jealousy, and resentment, and envy, all the normal things that everybody has, everybody knows. We're all that way. That's original sin. That's original sin. We carry that with us all the time. And everybody knows that they have that. Everybody, right? But you're not always reminded of it. And he reminded them of it in a very vivid and powerful way. I think that that's the key. And he was also talking about, talking to them at a particular time in the history of the Connecticut Valley when people particularly were much more secular than they were before. I am, in fact. You sit there in the pew, I am much more materialistic than my father was. Right? I want only the land that is next to mine. Right? That's the way I am. And everybody knew that. I am very attracted to that individual's husband, very attracted to that individual's wife. Right? Jimmy Carter said, I lusted after her in my heart. Right? Everybody knows that. That's what he was talking about. And there was a lot more of that in the 1730s than there had been 30 or 40, 50 years ago. Yes?
What is it that Edwards wanted to do in that sermon? How was it he felt he was being saved? Because he wasn't the one who believed in salvation through works. What was the step he was supposed to take in order to escape this spider in the pit of hell state?
Well, that's great, because on the one hand, you want people to behave it's a good question, you want people to behave in a virtuous way, and virtue to Edwards, as I suggested, meant charity and love. On the other hand, that does suggest justification through works, and they did not like that. So he does two things. He says, on the one hand, this is good in its own right. This is good in its own right. He says charity is a good. It's beautiful. It connects you with the beauties of the universe. He doesn't there promise that it's going to bring grace. He says good in its own right. But if you're saved, you will in fact be charitable. You will in fact be charitable. You can't earn it, but you will in fact be more charitable. So if you think of yourselves as Christians, if you have in fact been justified, you will in fact behave the way I'm telling you to behave. That's what he's saying. Now, is that totally satisfactory? Not quite. Not quite. But that's the argument. That's the argument. Puritans always had trouble with justification through faith and justification through works because they wanted it both ways. But that was based, it's good in its own right, and it is an indispensable consequence of justification. Yes, Jane, I knew you were.
Ron, it's wonderful actually. You portray Edwards as a kind of soul of rectitude against community that was slipping all the time, and suggest that that was a fundamental tension in Northampton at that time. But was there, you also talked about secularism, but you equate that with materialism. Was there an intellectual brand of secularism? Was there a debate within the community over Edwards that was not based in materialism, not based in depravity, but really had more of a secular kind of anti-establishment tone? And was, of course, the power 50 years later. We know there was a liberal pastor in Springfield who was every bit as liberal as Edwards was in his own way, sternly conservative. But I'm wondering whether these currents were beginning to surface in Northampton.
Yes. I don't know about Northampton so much, but certainly in the immediate area. In the immediate area, there was a big debate about how Calvinist do you need to be? How Calvinist do you need to be? Do we have to really believe so much in hellfire and damnation? And do we have to be so damn perfect? I mean, isn't there kind of a middle ground? That's what Boston preachers were starting to preach and so forth. So it was a tremendous polemical debate about that. In Northampton itself, I don't know so much. I don't have that kind of record. I'm not sure anybody does. He was a communitarian. That's one thing. The community can be fairly conservative or it can be fairly egalitarian. And most people think of Edwards as a conservative communitarian. And I was trying to convey that there is another dimension to him. He was much more of an egalitarian communitarian than people think. But communitarianism to some extent stands athwart individualism. And there is quite a bit of evidence that Northamptonites are feeling more individualistic. I will not worship a wig is a good example of that. I don't care a turd or fart is an example of that. Night frolicking, that really drove him crazy. He would go out of his mind today, actually. He did not like it. Let me see if I want to be specific about this. He did not like it when people thought about themselves too much. If you frolic at night, if you covet goods or people too much, if you drink too much, if you do that sort of thing, you're not thinking enough about everybody. You're thinking too much about yourself. That's fundamentally what he hated. That was the essence of American individualism. And eventually, of course, it's explained as individualism creates a greater common good. But that was incomprehensible to Edwards. Incomprehensible. That was just, you couldn't even imagine that individualism could produce a good society. Is that? Yeah. Yes?
Edwards is born about the same time as Benjamin Franklin.
Yeah.
Is had a reasonable antinomy to set up between those two, one looking forward to a progressive materialistic America and the other looking backward to pure Calvinism?
I think so. That's been done before, and I think that that's reasonable. There are some similarities, but Franklin was, of course, an individualist and a materialist. To the extent that he was religious at all, he was a deist. He had a strong sense of community, and a lot of people argue that Franklin's sense of community grew out of his religious background, right? But he left the religion behind and and carried on with the communitarianism when he went to Philadelphia and started the fire company and the library and all that stuff. That was an expression of communitarianism. So you didn't, in fact, as it turned out, have to be religious to be communitarian. You left the religion behind.
Does Franklin ever comment on Jonathan Edwards?
I don't know. I don't think so. He does comment about the Great Awakening experience, and there's this comical episode in his autobiography where he says he went to see what was going on to one of the revivals, and they passed the collection plate because these guys were itinerants, and he found himself emptying his pockets. Right? Before he knew it, if you know anything about Franklin, it's really startling. And Franklin himself was startled, and he was saying basically this shows how you can get carried away. But I would say that, let me say one other thing, Edwards was not so backward looking. Right? He believed in the Christian Commonwealth, but Commonwealth was terribly important to him. He couldn't imagine that Commonwealth could come out of any source except Christianity. But it's not hard at all to imagine the great waves of reform in the antebellum period or around the turn of the century, or even I would say in the 1950s and 60s coming out of some of the ideas that Jonathan Edwards had. So he has it's one of the progressive strains comes out of Edwards, I think, and one of them comes out of him. Yes?
You made a lot of sermons, told people how to live. Was there anything that indicated that there was a dialogue going on, that he was receiving information back and accepting it, rather than just fighting against it?
There's not a lot of evidence that he paid much attention to what his own parishioners thought. I was at lunch. This question came up. What was important to him, and I said there were three things that were important. The most important thing was figuring out the nature of things. This Edwards, the philosopher. It was really important to understand free will and the nature of matter and all that stuff. That was huge. It was important to reconcile it with the Bible, but you really had to understand that. That was the most important thing to him. Secondly, was preaching a good and effective sermon. Right? That was the second most important thing. Third most important thing was pastoral care. And he wasn't as interested in that and didn't really do as good a job at it. You can't do everything. Can't do everything. So I would say he didn't listen as much. He had a voluminous correspondence with people outside the area. But I don't think he listened too much. That's just an impression. I don't think he listened too much internally. Yes?
The Edwards and the Indians,
Yeah.
tell me on that.
Well, let's see. It depends on what you mean by Indians. There is a new interpretation about the Connecticut Valley in colonial history that emphasizes the horrors of colonial warfare, of Indian settler warfare. And the way this kind of warfare is described and depicted, it really sounds like the most savage kind of guerrilla warfare. If you imagine the war that was in Vietnam or in Yugoslavia or something, it sounds like that, where people were just bashing each other's heads in all the time. It was more horrific than most of us are conscious of, and there was much more terror and much more fear. And one of the arguments about the evolution of these churches is that in the 17th century, when Indian warfare was most intense, and when the fear was most extreme, is when you had a close, the most intense circling of the wagons around the church and the village. That is, Solomon Stoddard, his grandfather, wanted everybody in the church, and they were willing to come because they needed help. They needed help. There were Indian depredations, as they saw them on every side. By the time Edwards was preaching in the 1730s and 40s, the Indians had been moved pretty much out into Berkshire County, right? Just out on the frontier, out on the frontier. So you don't really read very much about that aspect of the Indians. When he was dismissed from his pulpit in 1751, the only job he could get, essentially, was to go to Stockbridge and teach at an Indian school. It's probably maybe what you're thinking about. I'll tell you, when I read his experiences there, first of all, it gave him more time. He didn't have to have all these quarrels with his church. And he wrote some of his great theological tracts in Stockbridge. Secondly, he took it extremely seriously. It is really quite remarkable to step back from the Stockbridge years and think this is one of the most accomplished intellectuals of the 18th century. Spending an enormous amount of time teaching 12-year-old Indian boys how to read and write. And he did it because he saw them as potential members of the Christian community, which to some extent was progressive. Right? I don't want to say that he's a social gospeler, but he did think of Indians as having souls, and it was important to teach them how to read and write and so forth. Thirdly, when he got there, he discovered that a lot of money had been stolen by the people who were running the school. And he spent a lot of time after he got there trying to make things run in a more honest way. And of course, it would be like going to Iraq and finding Halliburton running everything. It's not easy to fix. Right? It's not. We have a chance to fix it next fall, and I hope everybody pays attention. But when he went to Stockbridge, he took his Indian charges seriously, and he did try to make things run more honestly. But is that sort of? Yeah, that's what I would say about it. Yes?
This was about 150 years before man tried back to try to put something in the period. So this time, in other books that period, the fact that an angry God might be punishing people with either typhoid or cholera or smallpox. What was Jonathan Edwards doing? He hasn't mentioned anything about this. And then I noticed that he died of smallpox.
Yeah.
Was any remarks that were made about that?
Well, he was extremely interested in modern science and was not averse to it. It was just something to deal with. He was not a scientist. He was a Christian. He was a Calvinist. But he believed that Calvinism, unlike, I would have to say, unlike the denomination that I grew up in, Southern Baptism, it couldn't simply be swept away, right? This was so important and so obviously true that you had to somehow incorporate it into your worldview or you're going to be lost. So he took science seriously, believed that it had a lot to teach us, was inoculated for smallpox and died because of it, but he was willing to do that. He believed that worked. Epidemics are like the falling down of the balconies of the church. They feared and hated them, but if they happened, boy, you could really go to town for your next several months of sermons. And there were epidemics in early 18th century New England, and of course they were always used as, look, God is angry with us, or God is telling us to come back to the church, or God is telling us to be more charitable, or whatever. It depends on your temperament. Yeah, good point. Yes?
At what point does Unitarianism of Emerson, for example, become a factor in New England religion? And was that to some result a reaction against the excesses of the way?
I think so. I think it was a reaction against two things. It was a reaction against the Calvinism of Edwards, which didn't give human beings all that much leeway in shaping their future, at least their spiritual future. Unitarianism, you don't, for example, have to have the atonement. I mean, the important thing about Unitarianism is Christ does not have to die on the cross in order to get you to heaven necessarily. Right? They got rid of that. I mean, there is a single Godhead. And it gives you, it seems, more leeway and latitude. And the other thing is that Unitarianism removed a lot of the social, a lot of the constraints that people had about their behavior. For example, Edwards would not have approved of Boston Unitarianism, not only because it got rid of Christ, but because it gave people leeway and latitude to make all the money they wanted. Right? To make all the money they wanted. There is no judgment in Unitarianism. And therefore, you're free, unless you have an innate moral sense. You're free to behave any way you want to. He would have found that extremely disagreeable. So he's Christian Commonwealth, both of those things are right at the center
you.